I'm going to be talking to veteran oil and gas communicator Tony Rino, who's based in Calgary, about his recently completed master's thesis. I know something you don't know: analysis of perceptions of environmental, social, and governance reporting in the Canadian oil and gas industry. And this has been of interest to me for a long time because there is some misunderstanding and difference of opinion about what ESG is and how it should be used by investors when they're evaluating oil and gas companies for investment. So welcome to the interview, Tony.
Thanks, Markham.
Well, look, I'm glad to have you here. And why don't we start with an overview of your thesis, please?
Sure. So, the idea started, I've worked in oil and gas for a long time. The idea started when I was first posting an ESG report for an oil and gas company I worked for. And it was the first time I had heard this term ESG. I'd been through sustainability, stewardship, CSR reporting for a number of years, and suddenly it had changed to this ESG terminology. And, I thought, quite frankly, it was a lot more literal terminology. The other ones might be a little bit more ambiguous. And so that caught my eye right away. But how much work goes into these things and how deep they are and how much content is in them. I just wanted to see it shared more, and I wondered why. And then part of the realization was this was for an investor audience. And so then I thought, well, why are we putting it on our website? Why don't we just send it to the investors? What's the point in putting it out publicly? So all of these questions kind of came into my mind. And at the same time, I'm working on a Master of Arts in Communications program through Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax online. And I thought, this could be a really cool topic for ESG or for a master's thesis, to understand what people think about ESG, how they think it's best communicated, and get those perceptions. So away it went.
Well, and let's maybe explain a little bit for the viewers. ESG is important because it's a measure of how investors assess risk. And in the oil and gas context, a lot of that is about climate risk caused by GHG emissions. And it happens in, particularly with the oil sands in Alberta, that the emissions are quite high relative to other grades of oil. And so the industry is a little sensitive about that perception, the focus on emissions as opposed to the E or the S. So tell us a little bit about how, folks, what was their perception of ESG when you asked them? What did they think about it?
Yeah, and that's great. And I had kind of this focus statement going into this because there are so many rabbit holes in our industry, right, to dive down to. So, my statement was essentially, this is not about ESG matters. It's about communicating ESG matters and the perceptions of it. But then in brackets, it's not about ESG matters, but it kind of is, because you sort of have to understand the context before you can understand how to communicate it. So, the questions I asked were, what do you think of the companies? What do you think of ESG, of the reporting? What's more important to you of the three? What's least important to you of the three? And I should explain a little bit about the sample set too. So there were 23 people who I interviewed. 12 of them are oil and gas industry professionals who have worked with CSR or ESG reporting in the past to some capacity. And then 11 were Canadians. So it was great. I had, someone from Quebec, someone from Ontario, from each of the provinces, in fact, which was great, most of them, which was great, sort of a sample set of, of who was there and in the crowd. And no surprise, the industry people obviously knew more about it. And I was really focused on understanding, what Ontario people think of us, what the Quebec folks think. The Quebec person in my study had some really vivid metaphors about, they called ESG a canvas of thoughts, and that, they all need to work together, that they can't be, they can't be separated. And I thought that was a pretty rich piece.
Now, of the folks that you interviewed, were any of them investors?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and that's a very good question. So of the 11 publics or non-industry people who I interviewed. And there were some privacy things, of course, signed, so not revealing too much about them unless they revealed it in the interviews. And two revealed that they were involved in the investment community. One is a banker and one is a pension fund administrator. And so they were both, and the banker is at a more of a senior level. And so they're both disclosed in the interviews that they are very aware of ESG and how important it is to what they do and to how they advise, their clients. So I thought they brought some good insights, understanding, for instance, that there isn't a common standard yet for ESG reporting. There are several standards, but industry, as of now, hasn't agreed on one.
Well, a question I really want to ask you is, were there people, and perhaps within the industry, but maybe outside the industry, who were critical of ESG? Because I've participated in some of these discussions where folks within the industry are not happy about the way the ESG scores, because that's quite often there are third-party agencies that compile ESG scores and that assist the investors in making a decision. But folks in the industry don't like that all the time because it gives their company maybe a lower score than they think it deserves. So what's the take on that? Not everybody like it. What?
Oh yeah, they were great interviews. There were definitely industry folks who said that ESG is just right now. What did someone say? It's 25 miles wide and an inch deep. And it needs to be the other way around, or maybe a version of it the other way around. But it's just spread too far. So yes, absolutely. There were industry people who were critical. It was not a, sing along or, a happy time for all of them. And they were individual interviews. So I thought that was great. I asked the same questions to everybody, whether they were industry or publics. And I thought they offered some really good advice about, the lack of standards was definitely a big piece. One of the participants actually got into things like, is it 1 billion trees or 1 million trees, or what difference does that make? Is the average person going to know, those numbers that don't necessarily resonate with people? Yeah, and one more was that I thought was just great was one industry person who said, it's no longer just about doing the right thing. You're not going to get access to capital if you don't do the right thing.
Yes, that's what it all comes down to in terms of ESG. Oh, look, you said something about, what does the public know? What do people know? And I want to run, I have a little pet theory and I want to run past you, which is that in cases like ESG, it's not so much detail, it's not literacy that's the issue, it's narrative. It's these broad sort of narratives that are about, whether the industry is ESG compliant or ESG friendly, or is its emissions. That's what people remember. And then you reinforce that in storytelling. And I know that the communications of ESG in the oil and gas industry was a big part of your thesis. So maybe, what's your take?
Well, you raise great points that are echoed in the research. So I had two non-industry participants refer to the reports as blah, blah, blah. And I thought that was great. And there's some research that backs this up, that, the big language that I go into in the thesis, that the big language is there to, one theorist claims that it's there as a distraction. It's there intentionally to sort of, push you off. But several of the non-industry people said, it was blah, 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 language I didn't understand, went in one eye out the other kind of thing, wasn't able to process. And so that's a big obstacle for industry to overcome. I mean, it's, you're so close to it, in my view, that this is, really great advice to hear this and to understand that it needs to be, the other piece of it was it needs to be compartmentalized. It needs to be, an appetizer as opposed to a great big meal. that gets thrown your way. So, the industry folks the public participant folks were very critical of the blah, blah, blah piece of ESG reporting, right?
Well, Tony, let's wrap up this conversation. What's the big one or two takeaways from your thesis that you would like industry to understand?
It's great. I think it kind of tried to wrap it up, and it's a long thesis, and it's a qualitative thing. So, I do want people to sort of soak on a lot of this and think about the analytics and think about how, what questions we have as communicators and what questions our audience has. And I think that, the big piece going right into it was, we've shifted our focus from these community reports and sustainability reports to this ESG investor focused report. And as one person said, we've kind of forgotten the other stakeholders. And what the takeaway from my research is that you can't forget them, because those people, if you're forgetting the publics, they talk to investor analysts. And so it's a circular argument in some ways. If you forget about the average Joe is the guy who's going to go to the bank and say, who do I invest in? And I don't want to invest in those guys because their ESG report was blah, blah, blah. So I feel like you absolutely can't, ignore the public audience. They are really critical to the success of the industry.
Well, then in that case, I have one other question for you based on your answer. And that is, you're a communicator. I've in columns and other public, criticized the industry for not telling its own story well. So do you address that bigger issue of the industry has just got to talk to people better, it's explained. It's not literacy, but talk about those narratives and tell stories about what it's doing, the good stuff.
Totally. One of the, a series of questions I ask is kind of would you rather's questions with people. And, it's like, would you rather hear from the company or from an employee? Would you rather hear a story or facts and stats? And for the most part, people want to hear stories. I think one of the best takeaways for me was from a public who said, try something different, try a grand narrative approach, as opposed to this outputs, not outcomes, as another person put it. And I'm not saying that all the reports are this way. They certainly aren't. There's some that are quite good. We, I asked people to look at 7 of them before their interviews. But I really liked that idea of challenging how we communicate these kinds of reports. Someone else said this was a great report for the early 2000s, but take it into video, tell me a story, bring me into this stuff, because those reports are so deep and so thick, and people work on them, year round. And I love those folks right there. I'm one of them. We are so passionate about it, but tell us a story. I'm all in for the stories. Absolutely. I would love to see that. So the grand narrative idea, oh man, when can we start? Right?
Well, Tony, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Thank you, Markham.